Director here, and it is my delight to welcome you, whether you're joining us here in person or online. This is the forum where each week we hold sacred conversations about the things that matter. And this Sunday, we're excited to have with us Dr. Simran Jeet Singh. He's the author of The Light We Give, How Sikh Wisdom Can Transform Your Life. He also serves as Executive Director of the Aspen Institute's Religion and Society program and holds a PhD from Columbia University, where he happened to be one of my teachers. So it's a special joy to welcome you here, Simran.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Great to be with you all. I was trying to think of what I wanted to share with you, and there are two experiences in particular that I want to highlight that sort of speak to two aspects of my journey. One is what my life is like growing up as a Sikh in America, looking the way that I do. And I wanted to offer that to you all. And also, part of what my experience has been is drawing from Sikh wisdom to help navigate some of the challenges that I faced, especially around racism. And part of what I've come to believe is that some of this wisdom is universal and can be a guide for all of us. And so I wanted to sort of share some of that with you. The place where I'll begin is the place where I was born, and it's far, far away. You might have heard of it before. It's called Texas. It's a different place, a strange place, and I'm not quite sure why my parents thought that that would be the place to raise 4 brown-skinned, turban-wearing boys. We were the only family in all of South Texas that wore turbans. And so much of my experience was, especially as a child, learning how to understand not just how I saw myself, but also how other people saw me. And in many conversations around racism, we focus on what's malicious. And what I want to share is, especially during childhood, most of my experience were not coming out of malice, but out of curiosity, right? Other kids just saying, hey, what's that thing on your head? What language are you speaking? Why do you eat those foods, right? Just very simple, and I wasn't offended by any of it. And at the same time, they were reminders to us that we were seen as different. And in many ways, my brothers and I saw ourselves as normal, everyday Americans. We loved sports. We still love sports. We were big Spurs fans. That was our team. We got along well with our neighbors and our classmates, and soccer and basketball, we were playing all the time. And so in many ways, it was very normal. And as we started to get older, we understood that it wasn't very typical what we experienced. And I want to share one particular anecdote with you all that was very instructive for me and helped me form my understanding of Sikh philosophy and how it can serve as a balm for today's world. So in 4th grade, we went to my older brother's 5th grade class party. It was at a roller skating rink. It was across the street from where we played baseball and soccer every weekend. So we had been to this rink dozens of times before. And we walk in the door, and there must have been a new manager because he was unfamiliar to us. But we walk in, and he looks at us, and he shouts angrily, "Get out of here with those damn rags on your heads." And this was not our first experience of racism. We had experienced it with adults before, and in every situation before we were able to resolve it. So my brothers and I were kids. We know what's going on. We have a parent with us. And so we let our mom go handle it, and we go to the arcade to just wait it out, let her sort it out, and then we could go skate. And after about 10 minutes, we are getting impatient. We're getting frustrated. Our friends are having fun. We want to be with them. And so I walk over to my mom, and she's at the counter, and she has her back to me, and I pull on her shirt. And she turns around, and she's crying. And it was the first time I'd ever seen her cry. And I didn't know what to do, so I started crying too. And she says, "Why are you crying?" You know, she puts her arm around me. "Why are you crying? What's wrong?" And I said, "Well, obviously, this is unfair. They should let us skate. That's the same reason you're crying is why I'm crying." And she said, "Actually, I'm crying for a different reason. I'm crying because we're so lucky." And I thought, you must not be understanding what's going on here. How could you be feeling fortunate in a situation like this? And she goes on to explain to me, well, I talked to the parents and the teachers. I told them what was going on, and they've all agreed to walk out together. And for me, a few lessons from this moment. One is, in a situation where she should have felt entirely powerless, right? Now I have kids of my own. The last thing I ever want, and my wife and I talk about this all the time, is for them to feel like they're being left out or excluded. In a situation where someone is discriminating against her kids and she has no real recourse, she should have felt powerless, but somehow she was able to figure out a way to reclaim her power. And I saw that, and I wanted to know how to do that. And there were a couple of other things I observed. Again, I'm 10 years old, so I'm just sort of watching her and figuring out what's going on here. Another aspect of what I experience in this moment is real gratitude in the way that she felt it in that moment. And I didn't have language for it then. But there are a couple of ways in which I could understand why I felt grateful. First is, the easiest thing for her to do in that situation was to say, we're not doing this, we're walking out. Her and her 4 kids walk out, we'll miss this party, we'll get the next one, it's fine, we might be sad for a little bit, it's okay. The next easiest thing for her to do was to say, well, just take off your turbans and skate. Like, we'll let it go this time, and then next time you can wear your turbans. When we walk out the door, you can put your turbans back on. She didn't do that either. What she did instead was something that I don't think we do culturally today, and something that I find very helpful for thinking about how we deal with our challenges. And she didn't tell people what to do, but she invited them. She invited them to care just by sharing what was going on. So she goes to the other teachers and the parents and says, here's what's happening. I just want you to know, you're welcome to show up however you want, and left it to them. And I think today, what we see going on around us in this world is to say, here's what you have to do, or you're part of this group and it's your fault that I'm being discriminated against. Why don't you go fix the problem? Or we have judgments about everything that's going on and what we expect people to do, or we get upset that they don't know. Like, why don't you know that this is happening? Why do I have to explain it to you? And in this case, what I saw that was so instructive was she just took a simple step of opening up, and that enabled other people to open up in the way that they wanted. And the last aspect, and this is one I want to sort of come back to in a moment in another anecdote, is the most powerful aspect of this experience for me was this new feeling that I'd never had before. And I didn't have language for it then. I think we do now. But it was this understanding that the people around me actually cared about me. And I think that's also something we're missing in our society today. I mean, if you look at the indexes around social trust, they're all dwindling, right? We don't feel like other people care for us, whether it's on the basis of our race or our political affiliation or on the basis of our gender identity. I mean, whatever it is, everything is decreasing in terms of trust. And in this moment, here is an example of how you build trust. And that is, my friends who wanted to skate were willing to give up that party, something they cared about, because they cared about me more. As a 10-year-old, I felt that. And now I can describe that as solidarity. I could describe that as compassion and care. At that age, all that mattered to me, like I didn't even need the fancy language or the frameworks. At that age, all that mattered was I felt that people cared about me. And that created a different level of trust and relationship for me as a 10-year-old. So this is all just, a very simple anecdote that shapes my understanding as a kid. Some of these are drawing from Sikh principles. I'll share them with you, and we can sort of understand how we get to a point where we can build towards this. But what I want to share with you is these kinds of incidents and experiences we're facing all the time in our own lives in different ways. And typically we're not quite sure how we want to show up in those moments. And I think there are a few principles we can look at that can help us show up differently. I want to give one more story and then briefly sort of show you how I would describe these principles. A few years later, not that much later, I'm 18 years old, senior in high school, and we hear that in New York City, there's been a terrorist attack. And like many of you, hard to believe that something like that could happen in our country. We hadn't had an attack on our soil. Feel really, really uncertain about what this would mean for us as a country. It's just, you feel attacked, you feel threatened, you feel vulnerable. We went to my teacher's classroom, watched the Twin Towers come down, and about 30 minutes after the towers came down, the anchors announced they had a suspect. And they flash an image on the screen of a person I'd never heard of before, Osama bin Laden. And as soon as his image came on the screen, my friends, my teacher, they're looking at me, and in my head, I'm like, oh my God, my life is never going to be the same. And it wasn't. Right, that day, my mom comes, picks us all up from school early. She brings us home. We don't talk in the car. We don't talk when we walk into the house. We lock the door. We turn on the TV to see what's happening to our country. And the death threats started coming that day. Phone calls, people driving by. Incredibly, again, racism is not new for us, but this got intense. A really intense. We were on lockdown in our home for a couple of weeks, not going out, threats still coming, and during the days we would watch TV to understand what was happening to our country, and during the evenings we would get on conference calls with other members of the Sikh community around the country and try to understand what was happening to our community, the racist backlash. So people would report, this person was attacked, this is how they're doing, this person was attacked, this is how they're, it was, as an 18-year-old, you sort of feel invincible and that nothing will happen to you. And now I started to understand that it was no longer safe enough for me to ignore the racism that came my way, that I had to actually deal with it. And the sort of jolting moment that inspired that reaction from me was 4 days after 9/11, the first murder in post 9/11 America out of hate happened in Mesa, Arizona, of a Sikh gas station owner, turban, beard, brown skin. And what I've learned since in the story is the person who killed him described himself as a patriot, described himself as getting revenge for the terrorist attacks, and he described the people he wanted to kill as Iranian, Arab, Middle Eastern, ragheads, towel heads. A very clear understanding of something that I hadn't understood until this point, which is, let me say it this way, racism has never made sense to me, right? The logic of it is there. You can tease it out, but in terms of a human experience, I've never got it. And this was in a moment where I didn't get it, but I could see how finally people were starting to see me as the enemy, because they were taking these identifiers, right? The skin color, the beard, the turban, and they were like, oh, I see you in the same way that I see these enemies. And I'm 18 years old. I'm trying to figure out what to make of this. And part of the question then becomes, what do you do in a world where you see yourself a certain way and other people see you differently? And I think that's all of our experiences, whether it's on the basis of your age, your gender, your profession, where you live, we're constantly making assumptions about one another. And we live now in a society where these judgments are fracturing us, are dividing us, and it's making it even more difficult to get beyond them. This is where I was as an 18-year-old trying to figure out my way forward. And that's when I started studying Sikh philosophy. I was really interested in understanding not just what was happening in our country, but then who were the people? I didn't know any Muslims. Started studying religion in college, right? Started studying Islam, started studying Judaism, Christian. It put me on a new trajectory just because of my racialized experience. And I started studying my own tradition too as part of this. It was the first time that I actually really dug into it. And I learned that some of the answers that I've been looking for are baked into that philosophy. And I just want to share with you the 3 basic building blocks of Sikh teachings that have been answers for me in trying to navigate this world. The first is a principle we call Ik Onkar. It means the oneness of all creation. A very simple concept, right? It's the first thing I learned as a Sikh. It's the first word in our scripture. It's the first thing I've taught my daughters. And they get it, right? As a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, they understand that the divine permeates the whole world, that there's as much God in me as there is in you. It's not that complicated of a concept, but the implications are profound, right? If you truly believe that everyone is equally divine, then there's no place for discrimination on any basis. There's no place for, if you believe God inhabits the entire world, then your natural impulse is to care for the world. So this is the basic teaching of Sikh philosophy. And what I want to offer is it's so different from how we think about our world in the West, especially today, especially if we're thinking about conversations around diversity and inclusion or racial justice. And so many of our conversations are, you need to see my difference in order to understand me. I need to see you in contradistinction to myself. And what Ik Onkar says, and what a lot of wisdom traditions offer us, is actually you start with the oneness. You start with our shared humanity. And then you can start to see the differences as expressions of that oneness, of that's what diversity is. And then it's not threatening anymore. It's then something you can embrace and love. So the principle of oneness, when experienced, is connection. And so the way that I would describe that in English is love. The second building block in Sikh philosophy. First is the oneness, then is the experience of that oneness, which is love. And we sort of know this, right? If you feel connected to people in your family, like my kids aren't here with me right now, I feel like I still feel connected with them. I'm still wondering what they're up to, right? That's what love is. It's just that constant connection. And I think the promise of spirituality is to say those experiences of love that are fleeting in our day-to-day lives, we can have them in every moment through spirituality, through spiritual connection. That's love. And then the last building block in Sikh philosophy is also something that I think is very intuitive, which is if you feel connected to the people around you, if you love, then your natural expression of that is service. You show up for people because you love them. And it's not obligation, right? I don't feel obligated to do things for my kids. I do feel responsible, that's different. I don't feel obligated, but it just happens because I care, right? And those of you who live in this way, you'll understand what I mean. Like, it's not really like you have a choice, you just do because you feel moved to do it. That's service. And in my view, this is what Cornel West means when he says, justice is what love looks like in public. That's what we aspire to do when we love. And I think that's also very different from how we are approaching our conversations around things like activism or equity or whatever it is, right? Ultimately, if we're moved by love and connection, the end point is justice, right? Because we care about one another. So that's what I thought I would share with you all, a couple of examples of what it looks like to live in this country, in my body, and in my tradition, and also how some of the teachings from Sikh philosophy, which I don't think are exclusive to Sikhs, and how some of these teachings can inform us, how they've helped me in dealing with some of the difficulties that I've faced and that you might face too. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Simran. Those of you who have questions for Simran, you can submit them by filling out a question card, and I believe my colleague, Diana Sarbu has questions today, and she will just signal to her. She'll bring a question card to you. You can fill it out and return it to her, and she'll bring them up. If you're joining us online, you can you can share your questions on the live chat on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. That's PTHOMPSON @STBARTS.org. Simran,
Nice.
I've had a lot of practice. Simran, Sikhism, I was even surprised to learn reading your book, is the 5th largest religion in the world. And yet so many Americans know very little, if anything, about it. Why do you think that is, and what can we do to address that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have a lot of ideas as to why most Americans don't know about the Sikh tradition. One is, and this is a blanket statement about American culture, having grown up in it and sort of breathed the air of it, we tend not to do a good job of knowing about anything that's not American, right? Like we don't know, we don't care. I mean, think about how terrible we are at geography. Cultural literacy for us is pretty rough, and I think it comes from this very self-centered view of American exceptionalism, right? The world revolves around us, so why would I ever learn about something that's across the world? Like, what difference would it make to my life? And as somebody who's trained as a historian and, of various cultures and traditions, I mean, I feel like we would be much richer if we were able to prioritize that culturally and especially for our kids. So that's sort of maybe an easier thing to say. One of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of why Sikhs are unseen in particular is, part of it is proportionality. There aren't as many Sikhs in this country. Like, it's the 5th largest world religion, but in the US, there's only about 500,000. Most Sikhs live still in the homeland of Punjab in South Asia. And so proportionally, you won't encounter many Sikhs in the way that, it might be strange to say it's the 5th largest religion, like how are you the only people with turbans growing up in Texas? That's part of it. And those demographics are changing with immigration patterns. But I would also say that in the Sikh tradition, we have a very clear belief that you don't have to be a Sikh to achieve enlightenment. You can come from any path. And the line that comes up in our scriptures is Sach kaho sun leho sabe jin prem kiyo tinhi prab payo. So the Guru is saying, listen to me, Sach kaho, I'm telling the truth. Jin prem kiyo tinhi prab, whoever loves, that's who achieves the divine. And so we have a very clear understanding that you don't have to be one of us to get there. And so we're not about, like, proselytization, missionizing has never been part of our logic. Like, who cares if you're one of us? And so there's never really been a concerted global PR campaign that says, hey, look who we are, right? It's more like we do it through just living and our actions. And so that probably also in some way contributes to not being seen in a world where religion so historically has been competitive, right? Like, we want to show that we're better than you, we want to get the numbers, like all that. Like, that hasn't been a game that we've been a part of, and that probably in the ways that not being seen has led to violence for us and marginalization, like it can be detrimental in some ways too.
I think that's something many Christians might be jealous of, the lack of an exclusivist claim, because so often Christianity leads with that. Yeah,
it's a funny thing about religion, and I mean in a Christian context, you could talk about that for Christian, but it's every religion is susceptible to that, and I think it's one of the dangers of religion, right? You could be up here and say there are Muslims who have exclusivist views. That's true, and that can lead to views of hierarchy and supremacy and violence. You could say that about Hindus. That's also true. That you could say it about Buddhists. You could say it about Sikhs, right? Like, so I'm sharing my perspective on my tradition, but like the danger is really, as we've seen historically, when religion meets power. And then you have challenges of empire, right? In the Christian tradition, so many historians say Christianity changed with Constantine, right? When Christian became the imperial tradition. And so, but that you could say that about any religion if you look historically. So yeah, I feel you, and also don't feel like it's only about Christians. It's all of us, right? It's a funny thing about religion. So.
I know you've had plenty of exposure to Christianity over the years, certainly growing up in South Texas, but also you taught at Trinity University in San Antonio, you taught at Union Theological Seminary. Can you talk about the key similarities and differences you see between Christianity and Sikhism?
Yeah, it's a tough question in that, like what do you mean by Christianity? There's so many
Exactly.
forms, right? And that's part of the experience. And the same is true for Sikhism, right? Like, it's easier when a tradition is foreign to say there are XYZ attributes of a religion. And so I could sit up here and make anything up about Sikhism, and you'd be like, okay, cool, like that guy. So but here's something that I'll say in terms of what I see as the best of the traditions and where I find really beautiful overlaps. I think the three principles that I shared in not just in certain strains of Christianity, but also like biblically and historically, this principle of oneness is shared, love is shared, service is shared. And so I think, to me, those aspects are really, really strong. I'll share one aspect that's different, that feels important to me as a difference. And this is not true for all Christian perspectives, and so let's keep that as a caveat. But one of the stories I share in the book is being so confused growing up in Texas, where all of my friends had some perspective on heaven and hell. And in the Sikh tradition, we don't have a strong perspective on this, and it's not something we emphasize. And so people would ask me constantly, I mean, out of care, but they would say, like, we want you to be saved. Like, what can we do to get you there? And for me, it was like, that logic is not persuasive because I don't even believe in the thing that you're saying I should try and avoid, right? Like, you're talking about hell and trying to scare me, and I'm like, yeah, I don't want that. Or you're talking about heaven and trying to invite me in, and I'm like, I don't want that either. But it's an important distinction, I think, in some ways, because in a lot of Christian practice, as I've come to see it, especially today, maybe not so much in the early, like pre-medieval period, there is intense focus on heaven and hell in a way that it becomes about the end as opposed to the means. And I'm not saying this is what Christian theology is espousing, and I'm not even saying all Christians live this way, but my experience of my Christian friends growing up was like, I'm not doing that thing because I don't want to go to hell. And it was almost a logic of fear, right? Like they're not inspired out of love, but they're inspired out of fear. And even like sort of what we see in the Gospels is like, in perfect love, there's no place for fear. And so to me, I see the tension there, and that's one of the things I love about the Sikh tradition. Like, the ambiguity of afterlife is an indication to me, like, that's not the thing to care about. The thing to care about is the here and now, and to find love within your life at this moment. And that's something that's really informed, at least for me, part of what I've come to love about the tradition.
So we have a lot of good questions. Can you talk about scriptures in the Sikh tradition and share favorite passages you might have?
Sure. So the Sikh scripture, it's like the Bible in some ways, and it's not like the Bible in some ways. So I'll speak to that. It's like the Bible in the sense that it is central to the community. It's different in that it is a text that is primarily written by and entirely compiled by the Sikh gurus themselves. And so it's written in poetry to music, and the experience of it is, my kids and my wife are at our place of worship, Gurdwara, right now. They will be singing. Somebody will be leading the singing with instruments and music. They will be reciting, and it's in multiple different languages. And so one of the things that's different about the Sikh scripture is kind of like the Quran. It is considered a revealed text, and the power of it would not be the same when in translation. And so my kids are singing in languages they don't know. Even I don't know all the languages in the scripture, which is called the Guru Granth Sahib. When I study, I will use translations or commentaries to help facilitate my learning. I mean, I happen to be a really big nerd, so I've studied most of the languages and can understand them, right? Like, that's my work. But most Sikhs, especially growing up in the diaspora, don't have direct access to the translation or to the meaning. They have to work through translations and then build the skills for language. The last thing that I'll say, and this is something interesting about the scripture, is when I said it's exclusively compiled by the gurus, which means our prophets put this text together, it's mostly written by the gurus themselves, which means it's their compositions that show up in the text, and it's a big text. I also can mention that there are also writings from other figures who come from other traditions. And, Hindus, Muslims, Sufis, I mean, it's multiple different traditions and strains. And to me, that's an indication of this point that I was sharing earlier, which is you don't have to be part of this community to achieve enlightenment. You don't have to be a Sikh to have wisdom, right? It can come from all sorts of places. And that has pushed me to stay open to drawing inspiration from anywhere that it might come.
You talked about growing up in a house of boys, and you're raising daughters. Can you talk about gender differences and how the tradition is experienced differently and how you might parent differently depending on gender?
Wow, this is the most real question. Like, everything else is sort of like, yeah, parenting questions. Ugh. Yeah, so I will say I was deathly afraid of having girls when we found out my older daughter I just didn't grow up around girls. I don't even know, like, even when my mom, she came early when my first daughter was born, and we were like, can you help change your diaper? And she was like, I don't know how to wipe a girl. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess that's true. So, like, yeah, there's like that basic stuff, but what I have found is that now I'm afraid of boys. So that's how it goes. Within the tradition itself, taking this principle of oneness, there is a strong tradition and theological clarity around non-discrimination. So there is within the tradition, there's no place for gender discrimination. So that's theologically the principle. Now, culturally, how that plays out in societies that are patriarchal, like South Asian society, or here in America, like, of course, there is also constant gender discrimination. So both things are true. One of the big differences of the experience for Sikhs in America, and for my experience from my daughters, is that while women are also invited to wear turbans, it's true that mostly it's men who wear turbans, and uncommonly Sikh women. And so my girls don't wear turbans. They are not as easily identifiable in the same ways, and that has its pros and cons. Part of what I share about in the book is how I think being so visibly different has actually helped me develop my character. Because every day when I put on my turban, I think about the values that it represents to me, and also I remind myself when I'm out in public, I better practice what I'm preaching, right? I better show up in the way that I say it. And that's, girls and women in our tradition don't have the same particular practice typically, and so they have less challenges when it comes to race and racism, but also what are the benefits that I'm drawing from this experience that they're not? And that's something my wife and I talk about. The last thing that I want to say is internally there's a conversation within the Sikh community about what it means that typically for Sikhs, our people don't usually care about us unless they're scared of us in this country, right? So like nobody has anything to say until I'm on an airplane or something, and they're like, no, not that guy. But also, when they do care about us, it's typically coming out of sympathy for a hate crime, right? So such and such person is attacked. Most people will be like, I feel terrible for those people, that shouldn't happen. But that's the only story they know. But that's also a very gendered experience. Most hate crimes against Sikhs are about men, and therefore most of the interventions are about boys and men. And so there's an internal conversation we're having about, well, what does it mean for Sikh girls and women to feel like they also deserve attention in our community, and that we're not only devoting resources reactively to the hate that we experience and that mostly boys and men experience, but also are thinking about the needs of our girls and women in our community. So that's an internal conversation, but I thought I'd share that perspective too.
You write in the book about the attack on the temple in Wisconsin a few years ago. I wonder if you can talk about the effect that had on you and how that changed your approach to what you do.
Yeah, that was actually when I was teaching at Columbia. So we must have, what year, do you remember what year we were together?
2011 to 2012. I think
so
it was the
been,
spring of 2012.
Yeah, the attack was fall of 2012. So it was around the same time we got to know one another. Yeah, I mean, I will say, first of all, as a former student, good job reading the book. I
do my homework.
Just trying to get your credit. The attack was, okay, so again, hate and discrimination is not new to our community. And what I'll say also is, in some ways, I'm actually really proud of this. Part of the rationale for adopting this unique physical identity was for our gurus to say, if you really believe in justice, we are going to make you the front lines of any kind of bigotry. So, a lot of people tell me, if you're tired of being treated this way, go back to where you come from. And first of all, I'm like, Texas. I don't think you did Texas. But second of all, there's an assumption that everyone in India looks the way I do, and that's not true, right? It's just the Sikh community that wears turbans and looks like this. So we've always stood out there too. And so this visible identity was very much an announcement. Like, we're constantly making this announcement every time we go out that says, like, if you want to hate, like, start with me, right? That's our tradition. And so the attack in 2012, part of a long history, not just in America, but going back to our origins, but in a way it felt really new. And part of that experience is, it's a white supremacist walking into a Sikh place of worship and just massacring people. And at the time, it was the worst mass shooting in a place of worship in the US since the Civil Rights Movement, since the bombing in Birmingham. And I say it was because since then we've had much more and much worse, right? Like that's the reality, unfortunately. But part of the experience for the Sikh community is we have never been in the national spotlight. Like, nobody knows who we are. This is the first time that, CNN is covering this live, Fox is covering, every major station was covering this attack. And we are realizing, in a way that we did after 9/11, but in a way that I think is a little bit more sophisticated now, as much as we can do to build ourselves as a community and have resources and education and training and tell people who we are, right? That was our response after 9/11. 9/11 happens, people don't know who we are, they attack us because they think we're the enemy, and we say, okay, let's educate. And after the attack in 2012, I think the community perspective shifts a little bit, or at least mine did, and those of the people that I work with, which is education is part of the solution, but what are we going to do about rooting out the core of the problem, which is white supremacy? And this person who massacred the Sikhs that day, he was a neo-Nazi leader for a long time. He ran some of the big message boards, like Hammerskins and so on. And so, at least for me, and there was a lot that changed for me after this experience, but one of them is, how do I move from a place where I am developing resources for my own community, which is important too, but at the same time, really taking seriously the pandemic of hate in a way that is actually going to make us safer in the long run. And it became a broader perspective that went beyond my community and said, if we want to do this, we need to do it from a vantage point that is going to serve everyone at the same time, and really focused on the challenges. So that, unfortunately, that problem has gotten worse. So I haven't done a very good job, and not many of us have in the last 12 years. It's continuing to get worse. But it's a big reason why I took this new role with the Aspen Religion and Society program, because that's really the focus of our work.
Yeah, can you talk about what that program involves?
Yeah, I mean, I like the Aspen Institute because it is a think tank, but also action-oriented. And so that was very attractive to me. I've never been someone who just wants to share ideas without acting on them. Our vision for the Aspen Institute's Religion and Society program is to say that it is possible to create a society where everyone thrives. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. It doesn't have to be competitive. We don't have to live in a world where some people have privileges on the basis of what they believe or how they look, and other people have disadvantages for those same reasons. So that's sort of what drives the work. I mean, in a word, it's dealing with inequities on the basis of religious difference. Of course, a lot of that comes out of my own experience of having to deal with some of these inequities. But what we try and do is identify key areas in which these inequities show up, right? So it might be hate and extremism. It might be representation in media. It might be inclusion in the workplace, right? So we can sort of identify different vehicles or issue areas to address and advance. And part of what I have found the challenge and the opportunity to be is, for the most part, not many people are thinking about these issues from the perspective of religious difference. And so, for instance, we have so much attention on racial inequity in the workplace, but you can't really deal with racism in America without attending to religious difference at the same time. So we're just sort of trying to layer in aspects of the conversation that are, I think, central. You can't talk about white nationalism and that problem and hate in America without talking about religion, right? Like Christian, right-wing Christian views are very much a part of white nationalism. So that's sort of the way that we're trying to advance the conversation.
There were several questions about service and the importance of service in the Sikh tradition, and seva is the term. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
One person asked about a temple in India, I guess, where they serve meals, thousands of people per day. Can you talk about that, and just in general a little more about the place of service in the tradition?
Yeah. Let me start from here. The way that I presented the principles of Sikh philosophy may have seemed like it's step by step. But I think the reality is, and this will be true of all spiritual, like it's mutually reinforcing. And what I want to say about service that I have found is many spiritual traditions identify the root cause of suffering, of human suffering, as ego, right? The sense of self and the inability to feel the connectedness with divinity because we create these walls between self and divine. In the Sikh tradition, the only way to really reduce ego, to limit ego, and eventually to erase ego is through the practice of selfless service, right? You serve others, and we've all experienced this in some way. I'll give you an example. During the pandemic, when it first hit, and we were in our apartment, we live on the Upper East Side, so not far from here. We're in our apartment, we're worried, just like everyone else. How are we gonna make this work? And then things start to settle, right? We're worried for good reason. Things start to settle, and still I find myself in this constant cycle of like, what do we need to do? Like constant concern, fear, worry about our little family. And my kids were young, and my wife was working at the hospital. So, I mean, again, legitimate fear, legitimate concern. But when those concerns should have started decreasing, I couldn't get there. I was so stuck in that cycle of really like focused on our own four walls. And I wasn't sure what to do about that. And I was starting to feel like, there's no way out. And then I started learning about Sikhs in the city who were traveling around delivering meals to people who needed them. So I just started volunteering with them. And it's, in retrospect, it feels obvious. Like our tradition always teaches us that seva, service, is a way to enhance your perspective, right? The world is not about you. You're not the only thing that matters. There's other stuff to worry. Like, sure, you're suffering, you should focus on, but you should also at the same time have compassion for others. And so it was a very practical experience that I had where I started to go out and serve people and then started to recognize, or then started to feel less self-centered in my own concern, right? Just a very raw example for me. But that's sort of the teaching, that service is both the most beautiful expression, but it's also a mechanism to reduce your ego. The tradition that you're talking about in the gurdwaras, it's true in India and it's true at every gurdwara around the world now, is a tradition called langar, Langar. It's an open kitchen, and it had a few functions. One is to provide a service to people who needed it, right? If food insecurity was the issue, which it was at the time and still is today, unfortunately, then we're gonna provide free food to anyone who wants it, and regardless of your background. And it has become such a well-known aspect of Sikh practice, especially in South Asia, that when you go to the larger centers, the one I'm guessing they're describing is the Golden Temple in Amritsar. My experience has been that there are usually more people who aren't part of our community, but just people who need meals that show up. And then there are also people from our community. So it's that, and that's developed and evolved in really interesting ways. Now, if you go to some of the worst humanitarian crisis areas in the world, where Red Cross and other NGOs won't go, you'll often find Sikhs showing up there to serve meals. And it's part of our tradition. We describe it as, within our prayers, our daily prayers, we talk about the Sarbat da Pala, which means the upliftment of all humanity. And so how do you live out that practice every single day? I mean, this is one way. So it's a tradition that I really love, in part because the food is amazing. So.
Well, unfortunately, we have to stop there, but I think that's as good as any place to stop. Thank you, Simran, so much for taking the time to be with us this morning.
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
And Simran's book is in our bookstore, so do stop by. It's in the narthex on your way out. And if you catch him before he leaves, maybe he'll even sign a copy for you.
Sure.
Next week at the forum, we welcome Scott Thuma from the Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. He's a researcher in the field of sociology and of religion, and he's going to talk about how churches and other faith communities have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So we'll have a chance to compare our own experience to the experience of faith communities throughout the country. And we hope you'll join us for that, and we also hope you'll stick around and join us for worship at 11 a.m. Thanks so much.